There is a particular kind of stillness that falls over a man when he hears bad news he already knew was coming. Not shock, exactly. Not surprise. Something quieter than that. Something heavier. The body goes very still, and the eyes go somewhere far away, and for a moment the whole world narrows to a single, unbearable point. That is the stillness that falls over Steve Rogers in November of 1943, standing in the rain in Italy, when he hears that the 107th Infantry Regiment has been wiped out. The 107th. Bucky's unit. He doesn't hear the rest of what they tell him. The words wash past. Casualty reports. Strategic assessments. The careful language the military uses to make catastrophe sound administrative. None of it lands. There's only the name and the regiment number and the terrible arithmetic of what it means. Barnes. And something in Steve's face changes. Not the jaw, not the eyes. Something underneath all of that. Something structural. As if a load-bearing wall has shifted and the whole architecture of who he is has rearranged itself around a single, immovable fact. Bucky might be gone. He finds Peggy Carter, and together they cross the camp at a pace that is not quite running but is certainly not walking. The rain is coming down harder now, turning the dirt between the tents to mud, and the wounded are still arriving. Stretcher after stretcher, the kind of procession that never seems to end once it begins. Steve barely sees them. His world has become very small and very focused and very clear. Chester Phillips is in his tent, and Steve goes to him directly. No preamble, no salute. Just the question, raw and open as a wound. Is Barnes alive? Phillips looks at him the way commanding officers have always looked at soldiers who are about to hear something they cannot bear. There's a tiredness in it, and a kind of practiced detachment, because Phillips has delivered this news before, many times, and he has learned that the kindest thing you can do is say it plainly. Barnes is likely gone, killed or captured at Azzano, along with hundreds of others, and no rescue mission is planned. The base is too deep behind enemy lines, the defense is too formidable, and the strategic calculus does not justify the risk. Phillips is sorry. Phillips means it. But Phillips has a war to win, and wars are not won by throwing good men after lost ones. Steve listens. Steve nods. And Steve does not accept a single word of it. You know people like this, perhaps. People for whom the word no is not an answer, but an obstacle. People who hear impossible and translate it quietly into not yet. Steve Rogers has always been this person, long before the serum, long before the shield, long before any of it. The body changed in that chamber in Brooklyn. The stubbornness was already there. He steals what he needs. Weapons, a leather jacket, a helmet, and the shield, that gaudy star-spangled prop from the stage show, never designed for combat, never meant to stop anything more dangerous than a choreographed punch from a man dressed as Adolf Hitler. It is a ridiculous piece of equipment for a rescue mission behind enemy lines. Steve takes it anyway, perhaps because it is all he has. Perhaps because he has spent enough time pretending to be a hero that the pretending has started to mean something, and the shield has become part of that meaning, whether anyone intended it to or not. Before he leaves, he finds Peggy Carter. He asks her, carefully, because he knows he is asking her to put herself at risk, whether she meant what she said when she told him he was meant for more than this, more than the stage shows and the bond drives and the dancing girls and the children's comic books. She meant it. Of course she meant it. Peggy Carter does not say things she does not mean. And so they go, Howard Stark flies them in. A small plane, loud and rattling, cutting through the night sky over Austria with a kind of cheerful disregard for anti-aircraft fire that only Howard Stark could manage. 30 miles behind enemy lines. The darkness below is total. No lights, no landmarks, just the vast black nothing of occupied territory rolling away beneath them. In the hold of the plane, there is a conversation. Awkward, the way conversations between people who care about each other but haven't yet figured out how tend to be. Steve asks about Stark, whether Peggy and Howard are, together. The question comes out sideways, clumsy, and Peggy's response makes it clear that the answer is no, and that the question itself was faintly ridiculous. Steve, who can now bench press a motorcycle, but still cannot navigate a conversation with a woman he admires, accepts this with the quiet embarrassment of a man who has just stepped on his own foot in front of someone he was trying to impress. And then the guns find them. Anti-aircraft fire, bright and sudden, punching through the darkness like angry stars. The plane shudders and banks, and Steve knows it is time. Peggy tells him she cannot give him orders. Steve looks at her, really looks at her, with something that is not quite a smile, and says, "The hell you can." He is a captain. Then he jumps. Let that sit for a moment. Let the image settle. A man, alone, falling through the dark sky over Austria in 1943, with a prop shield and a stolen jacket, and nothing else between him and a fortress full of soldiers, loyal to a man with a red skull for a face. No backup, no extraction plan, no guarantee of anything except that somewhere in that fortress, his best friend might still be alive. Might be. That is enough. For Steve Rogers, might be has always been enough. The landing is soft, or at least softer than it should be, the serum doing its quiet work on his joints and tendons, absorbing the impact the way his body has learned to absorb all impacts now. The Austrian night closes around him. Trees, mud, the distant rumble of trucks on a road he cannot see. Steve moves through the dark with a stillness that belies his size, all that new bulk somehow made silent by sheer force of will. He finds a Hydra truck. He boards it. The guards inside barely have time to understand what is happening before they are unconscious, and Steve is riding deeper into enemy territory, alone in the dark, the miles ticking away beneath him like the seconds of a clock counting down to something no one has planned for. The Hydra fortress at Azano is enormous. It sprawls across the landscape like something from a nightmare. All hard angles and blue light, the strange, cold glow of Tesseract-powered technology humming behind its walls. This is not a military base in any conventional sense. This is something else entirely. Something that belongs to Johann Schmidt's vision of the future, a future powered by a force that no one on Earth fully understands. Steve moves through it like a ghost. Corridor by corridor, shadow by shadow, the prop shield held close. He knocks out guards with the kind of efficient precision that comes not from training, but from desperation. The desperate focus of a man who has one objective and will not be distracted from it by anything as trivial as an army. He finds the prisoners first. Locked in cells deep in the facility, dozens of men, dirty, exhausted, half-starved, but alive. When Steve opens the cell, Gabe Jones looks at him and asks, with reasonable bewilderment, who he is supposed to be. Captain America, Steve says. And the men stare at him, because the last time any of them saw Captain America, he was on a poster selling war bonds, and now here he is in the flesh, 6 feet of impossible, standing in the doorway of their cell, in a Hydra base 30 miles behind enemy lines. Dum Dum Dugan, James Montgomery Falsworth, Jim Morita, Jacques Dernier. They are all here, and they are all, against considerable odds, alive. Steve gives them the broad strokes. Get out, fight your way through, head for the tree line. Then he keeps going, because the one man he came for is not among them. The corridors deeper in the facility are quieter, stranger. Steve passes through laboratories filled with equipment he does not recognize. Rooms where the blue glow of tesseract energy hums behind glass panels. Spaces that feel less like a military installation and more like something from a fever dream. And as he moves deeper, he catches a glimpse of a small man hurrying in the opposite direction. Arnim Zola, clutching blueprints to his chest, scurrying like a rat fleeing a fire he has not yet set, but knows is coming. Steve does not pursue him. Not yet. There will be time for Zola later. Right now, there's only one door that matters, and it is the door Zola just came through. The room is dim. There's a table in the center, and on the table, there is a man, strapped down, dazed, muttering something. His name, his rank, his serial number, the 3 facts a captured soldier is trained to repeat like a prayer when everything else has been stripped away. Bucky. Steve crosses the room in 3 strides and begins undoing the restraints, and Bucky looks up at him with eyes that are trying very hard to focus and not quite managing it. Whatever Zola has been doing to him in this room, whatever experiments, whatever injections, whatever horrors have been administered to Bucky Barnes while he lay strapped to this table, they have left him foggy, confused, swimming in and out of the present like a man caught between sleep and waking. And then recognition lands, slow, like dawn breaking. The fog clears, just enough, and Bucky Barnes looks at Steve Rogers and says, with the bewildered honesty of a man who is not entirely sure he is not dreaming, you're so much taller. There it is, that moment. 2 boys from Brooklyn, reunited in the belly of a monster, and the first thing Bucky notices, the first thing his battered, drugged, experimented upon mind can articulate, is that his best friend has grown. Not, how did you get here? Or, what's happening? Or, am I hallucinating? Just, you're taller. Because Bucky has known Steve since they were children, and some things matter more than context. Steve helps him up, gets him moving. There's no time to explain Project Rebirth, no time to describe the chamber and the serum and the Vita rays and the way his body was remade while Peggy Carter watched through the glass. When Bucky asks what happened to him, Steve simply says he joined the army, which is, in its way, entirely true. They make their way upstairs, through corridors that are now filling with smoke and the distant percussion of explosions. The freed prisoners are doing their work. The facility is coming apart. And as they climb, the air grows hotter, the blue light of Hydra technology mixing with the orange glow of fire. And then they are on a high catwalk. And there, across the burning chasm of the facility's core, is Johann Schmidt. Schmidt is delighted. That is the unsettling thing about him, the genuine pleasure he takes in this meeting. He tells Steve he is a great fan of his films. He observes, with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen, that Erskine clearly succeeded with Project Rebirth. He calls Steve impressive, in the way you might call a new piece of equipment impressive, and then adds, almost as an afterthought, that he is hardly an improvement. Steve punches him, hard and clean, right across the jaw. And the punch does something unexpected. It damages the prosthetic face Schmidt wears over his true one. The skin shifts, the mask cracks, and behind it, red begins to show. Schmidt hits back. The force is staggering, the blow denting Steve's shield, sending vibrations up his arm that the serum can feel but cannot quite absorb. They are matched, these two, both products of Erskine's work, both enhanced beyond human limits, both standing on a catwalk above a burning facility as the world they are fighting over tears itself apart around them. Zola separates them, a retracted bridge, a widening gap. And then Schmidt reaches up and removes the mask entirely, and the face underneath is, well, you know the face? Red, skull-like, a living wound, the cost of what happens when the serum meets the wrong heart. Bucky, standing behind Steve, looks at the revealed face and asks, with the kind of nervous practicality that only Bucky Barnes could manage in this moment, whether Steve has the same face under there. Schmidt tells Steve they have both left humanity behind. Then he turns and escapes in a jet-powered aircraft that rises through the smoke like something from a future that hasn't arrived yet. And Steve and Bucky are left alone in a facility that is rapidly becoming a furnace. What follows is simple and desperate. The only exit is across a chasm, and the only bridge is a steel beam, narrow, unstable, already loosened by the heat and the explosions. Steve sends Bucky first. The beam groans under his weight, shifting and settling as Bucky inches across, the flames rising beneath him, the heat pressing up like a living thing. Bucky makes it. Barely. He reaches the other side and turns back, and the beam gives way behind him, falling into the fire below with a sound like a cathedral collapsing. Steve is alone on the wrong side. There is a moment, brief, terrible, when Bucky tells him to go, to leave, to find another way. And Steve tells Bucky to get out, to save himself, because the mathematics of this situation are very clear, and both of them can do the arithmetic. But Bucky does not leave. Of course he does not leave. This is the same Bucky Barnes who followed a 90-pound asthmatic into every alley fight in Brooklyn, who never once walked away from Steve Rogers when walking away was the sensible choice. He stands on the far side of the chasm and he waits, because that is what you do when your best friend is trapped on the wrong side of a burning building. Steve bends a steel bar out of his path with his bare hands. He takes 3 steps back, and then he runs, and he leaps, and the fire rises beneath him like a wave, and for one suspended second he is in the air above the flames with nothing beneath him but heat and light and the very real possibility that this is how it ends. And then he lands, hard, on the other side, alive. They make their way out, through the smoke, through the ruins, into the cold Austrian night. Steve's radio is broken, damaged in the escape, so there is no way to tell a Peggy Carter that they are alive and coming home. They will have to walk, all of them, every last freed soldier, stumbling through the dark toward Allied lines, guided by nothing more than a compass and the stubborn certainty of a man from Brooklyn who simply refused to leave anyone behind. The march back takes time. Picture it, if you will, 400 soldiers, gaunt and exhausted and still half disbelieving, walking through the European countryside in the gray light of early morning. And at the head of the column, carrying that ridiculous prop shield, walks Steve Rogers, not Captain America the stage show, Not Captain America, the comic book character. Something new. Something real. A man who went alone into the dark and came back with everyone. When they reach the camp, Chester Phillips is waiting. Steve approaches him, and with the careful formality of a soldier who knows he has broken every rule in the book, asks the colonel to have his men seen to, and then to reprimand him for going AWOL. Phillips looks at him, looks at the 400 men behind him, and declines to press charges. Peggy Carter finds him in the crowd. She asks why he is late. Steve holds up the broken radio and tells her his ride fell through. And then Bucky Barnes, Bucky, who has spent the last however many days strapped to a table in a Hydra laboratory, who has been experimented on and drugged and broken and somehow put himself back together. Bucky steps forward and calls out to the crowd. He tells them to acknowledge the man who saved them, to recognize what just happened. And 400 voices rise together in a cheer that carries across the camp, across the muddy fields, across the war itself. And for one moment, one bright, uncomplicated moment, Steve Rogers is not a lab experiment or a stage show or a political symbol. He is just a man who brought his people home. Let that warmth settle around you. Let the sound of those cheering voices fade to something soft, the way sounds do when they become memories. Because what comes next is warmer still, the brief, golden stretch when everything comes together, when the pieces of Steve's life arrange themselves into something that feels, for the first and perhaps the last time, like belonging. London, the whip and fiddle, a pub that smells of old wood and spilled beer and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where the light is always amber and the noise is always just a little too loud, and no one minds because the loudness means you are alive and among friends. Steve walks in and finds the men he freed sitting around a table that is already crowded with empty glasses. He makes his pitch, not as Captain America, as Steve. He tells them he is putting together a team. He tells them the mission is to go back out there, back behind enemy lines, and hit every Hydra base they can find until there are no more bases to hit. He tells them it will be dangerous and cold, and that the odds are not particularly good. James Montgomery Falsworth leans back in his chair and says it sounds like good fun. Jim Morita nods. Gabe Jones and Jacques Dernier exchange a few words in French and agree. And Dum Dum Dugan, broad, solid, unflappable Dum Dum Dugan, sets down his glass and tells Steve that he will go anywhere and fight anyone, so long as Steve agrees to open his tab. Steve agrees. The table erupts. The Howling Commandos have their beginning. Then Steve turns to the one man whose answer matters most. Bucky is sitting apart, nursing a drink, watching the scene with an expression that is hard to read. Something between amusement and something else. Something quieter and more private. Steve asks him directly, will he follow Captain America into the jaws of death? And Bucky looks at him, looks at this new body, this new uniform, this whole new version of the friend he has known since childhood. And he says, quietly, with a warmth that cuts through the noise of the pub, that little guy from Brooklyn who was too dumb to run away from a fight. I'm following him, not Captain America, not the super soldier, not the shield, or the uniform, or the propaganda machine. Him, the kid from Brooklyn, the one Bucky has always known, the one he chose to follow long before anyone else saw anything worth following. Bucky is not signing up for a mission. He is keeping a promise that was never spoken aloud, but has been in force since they were boys. The evening deepens, the pub fills, and then something happens that makes the whole room go very quiet. Peggy Carter walks in. She is wearing a red dress, and there's nothing more that needs to be said about it, except that when she enters the whip and fiddle, every voice drops, every head turns, and the silence that follows is the particular silence of a room full of soldiers who have collectively forgotten how to speak. She moves through the amber light as if she owns it, and perhaps she does, and she finds Steve at the bar and tells him, with the straightforward clarity that is Peggy Carter's defining characteristic, that Howard Stark has some equipment he would like Steve to try in the morning. But that is not really why she is here. The music plays. She glances at the band, then back at Steve, and there is something in her eyes. An offer, a question, a door opening just slightly. When all of this is over, she says, when the war is done, they should go dancing. Steve, who has fought his way through a Hydra fortress and leapt across a burning chasm and marched 400 men to safety, stands at the bar and has absolutely no idea what to say. Bucky watches this from across the room with the expression of a man witnessing a natural law being overturned. He has spent his entire adult life being the one women noticed. He is used to Steve being the invisible friend, the small one, the afterthought. And now here is Peggy Carter, in that red dress, looking at Steve as if Bucky does not exist. When she leaves, Bucky turns to Steve and says, with something between admiration and genuine bewilderment, that he is getting used to being the invisible one now. And Steve, for once, gets to be the one who smiles. The next morning brings Howard Stark's laboratory, which is less a laboratory and more a playground for a man whose relationship with the laws of physics is best described as adversarial. Stark shows Steve weapons, equipment, technology that seems to belong to a decade that has not happened yet. But Steve's eye catches on something else, a round silver disc sitting quietly among the prototypes. Vibranium, Stark explains, the rarest metal on Earth, stronger than steel, a third the weight, and completely vibration absorbent. This shield is a prototype, the only one of its kind, made from all the vibranium Stark could acquire. It was never meant to be a weapon. It was an experiment. Steve picks it up, holds it, and it fits. Not just in his hand, in his story. This is not the prop shield from the stage show. This is not a symbol. This is the real thing, forged from something almost impossible, and it belongs in Steve Rogers' hands the way some things simply belong where they end up, as if the universe arranged itself quietly around the inevitability. While Steve is admiring the shield, Peggy Carter arrives. She sees the shield. She sees Steve. And she has not forgotten the incident with Private Lorraine, the kiss that Steve did not initiate, but also did not exactly prevent. And Peggy Carter is not the kind of woman who lets things slide. She picks up a pistol. She fires at Steve. 3 rounds, maybe 4, aimed directly at the shield he is holding. The sound is enormous, the sharp crack of gunfire in an enclosed space, and Steve flinches behind the vibranium, and the bullets flatten against the metal and fall to the floor, and the shield does not dent, does not crack, does not even ring. Peggy lowers the weapon, examines the result with the cool appraisal of a woman who has just conducted a perfectly valid scientific experiment, and says, "I think it works." Steve, standing behind the shield with the expression of a man who has just been shot at by a woman he is falling in love with, does not disagree. Howard Stark, watching from a safe distance, quietly makes a note to give these two a very wide berth. And then, and this is the part that settles into a rhythm, the part you can let wash over you, like the warmth of that pub, like the amber light, like the sound of friends laughing. Then the Howling Commandos go to war. Imagine a montage, but slower, gentler, not the rapid cut editing of a film, but the way memory works, moments that stand out, separated by stretches of time that compress into feeling rather than chronology. The forests of France, the mountains of Austria, the frozen fields of Belgium, Steve at the head of his team, shield on his arm, moving through the European theater like a force of nature that happens to care about the people in its path. They destroy Hydra bases, one after another, methodically, relentlessly, each one a small victory in a larger campaign, each one a step closer to the Red Skull. Bucky is at Steve's side through all of it, up on a ridge with his rifle, eye to the scope, watching Steve's back the way he has always watched Steve's back, since they were boys in Brooklyn and the threats were neighborhood bullies instead of energy weapons. There are quiet moments between the missions, campfires, cards, the particular camaraderie of men who face death together and choose to handle it by arguing about baseball. Dugan's laugh, which could drown out artillery. Falsworth's dry wit. Dernier and Jones switching between French and English, sometimes mid-sentence. And Bucky, always Bucky, sitting close to Steve with that easy grin that says, "We are here and we are together, and for now that is enough." Steve carries the compass with Peggy's photograph in it. He thinks the camera crew hasn't noticed. They have. The war turns, slowly, then quickly. The Allies advance. Hydra retreats. And somewhere in the machinery of this great, terrible engine, a scientist named Arnim Zola boards a train. Breathe in now. Let the story settle. Because what comes next is the thing that changes everything, and it deserves to arrive slowly, the way heavy weather moves across the mountains. Visible from far away, inevitable, and still somehow a shock when it finally lands. It is 1945. Winter. The Alps. The mountains are enormous and indifferent, all gray rock and white snow and wind that sounds like something grieving. Somewhere below, a train is moving through a narrow pass. An armored transport, fast and heavily guarded, carrying Arnim Zola to a destination that the Howling Commandos have every intention of making sure he never reaches. Before the mission, Steve and Bucky stand together on the ridge. The zip line is ready. Below them, the train is a dark shape threading through the white landscape, trailing smoke, and they talk. Not about the mission, not about the war, but about Coney Island, about the cyclone, about the time Steve rode the roller coaster and threw up, and Bucky laughed so hard he nearly fell over, and they were just two kids from Brooklyn, spending a summer day the way kids from Brooklyn spent summer days. Bucky brings it up, the memory, as if he needs to hold something warm in his hands before he steps into the cold. The train is spotted. The zip line is set. Dum Dum Dugan and Jacques Dernier work the rigging while Steve checks the line and calculates the angle and says what they already know. They will have a 10-second window to get aboard. 10 seconds between the rock and the rail car. 10 seconds of empty air above a ravine that goes down further than any of them want to think about. James Montgomery Falsworth wishes them luck. It is a small thing, those words, but it matters in the way small things matter before large ones. Steve goes first. The wind takes him. The line screams. And then he is on the train, and Bucky is behind him, and they are inside. The train is dark and loud, the rattle of wheels on rails, the groan of metal, the particular claustrophobia of a narrow space, moving at speed through a mountain pass. Steve leads. Bucky follows. Their weapons are up, their breath visible in the cold air, and the silence between the sounds of the train is the kind of silence that knows it is about to be broken. It breaks. A door slams shut between them, heavy, mechanical, deliberate, and suddenly they are separated. Steve in one carriage, Bucky in another, and Hydra soldiers in both. The ambush is clean, professional. These are not the ordinary foot soldiers Steve has been routing for months. These are prepared. Steve fights. This is not the place to dwell on the details. The exchange of fire, the swing across the carriage, the heavy assault weapon that he turns on the reinforced door to blast it open. What matters is what is on the other side. Bucky is fighting, outnumbered, outgunned, but fighting, because that is what Bucky Barnes does. Steve reaches him, passes him a weapon, and together they push back. A brief respite. Bucky makes a joke, something about having them on the ropes, something about a loud jerk back in Brooklyn, and for a moment it is like every other mission. Two boys from home, watching each other's backs. And then the Hydra soldier returns. The heavy weapon fires, and the blast catches Bucky, not head on, but enough to throw him sideways, through the torn metal of the train's wall, out into the screaming air of the mountain pass. Bucky catches the railing. The train is moving. The wind is pulling at him. The ravine is below, not below the way a floor is below, but below the way the earth is below when you are falling. A vast and patient emptiness, waiting with the certainty of gravity. Bucky's hands are on the railing, and the railing is damaged, and the metal is groaning under his weight, and his eyes find Steve's. Steve is there. Of course Steve is there. He has pushed himself along the outside of the train, one hand on the hull, the other reaching out, reaching for Bucky with every inch of his enhanced body, straining against the wind and the speed and the terrible geometry of the situation. His hand is outstretched. His fingers are open, and Bucky is reaching back. There is a sound, small, metallic, the sound of a bolt giving way, of metal surrendering to physics. The railing tears free from the train, and Bucky falls. Let the image hold. Do not rush past it. Let the wind howl through the mountains, because it does. It howls, the way wind howls in high places, indifferent and enormous, and filling every space where a voice should be. Let Steve's hand stay outstretched, fingers still open, still reaching for something that is no longer there. Let the absence land. Bucky falls, and the ravine takes him, and the white of the snow and the gray of the rock swallow him whole, and the sound of the train rolls on, and Steve Rogers is left on the side of a speeding rail car in the Alps, with his hand reaching into empty air. This is grief arriving, not the grief that comes later, with whiskey and quiet rooms, and the slow, grinding work of learning to live with loss. This is the first grief, the raw one, the one that hasn't yet learned its name. It is the moment when the world breaks open and you discover that it contains something you cannot replace. And now that thing is gone, and the wind fills the space where it was, and the wind is very, very cold. Steve's hand stays outstretched. The train carries him forward. The mountains do not care. The mission succeeds. This should be said because it matters in the particular cruel way that successful missions matter when they have cost you everything. Gabe Jones captures Zola. The intelligence Zola provides will prove invaluable. The capture is, by any military measure, a significant victory. Steve does not feel victorious. London again. The whip and fiddle again. But the amber light is different now. Or perhaps Steve is different in it. He sits alone at the bar with a bottle in front of him, drinking with the methodical determination of a man trying to drown something. But the serum will not let him get drunk. It processes the alcohol as fast as he can consume it. The same enhanced metabolism that heals his wounds and keeps him fighting also denies him this one small mercy. He cannot even have oblivion. The serum has made him something more than human, and the cost of that is that he must feel everything, all of it, with perfect clarity, without the softening mercy of a blurred edge. So he sits, and he drinks, and he is as sober as the morning, and Bucky is dead. Peggy finds him. She always finds him, this woman, in camps and labs and pubs and war rooms. She finds him, and she sits beside him, and she does not pretend that things are other than they are. It wasn't your fault, she tells him. Steve says it was, and in his voice there is a flatness, an emptiness that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the particular hollowness of a man who has reached the bottom of what he can feel and found it solid. Peggy does not argue with grief. She knows better, but she tells him, quietly and with the authority of someone who understands sacrifice. Barnes knew. He knew that the mission was worth his life. He made his choice. The same choice Steve makes every time he picks up the shield and walks into the dark. Steve looks at the bottle. He looks at the bar. And somewhere behind the emptiness, something begins to harden. Not heal, not yet, perhaps not ever, but harden into resolve, into purpose, into the particular dangerous clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose and one thing left to do. He tells Peggy he is going to take down the Red Skull. Every last Hydra soldier, every base, every weapon. He is going to end it. Peggy looks at him, and she does not try to talk him out of it, and she does not try to soften it, and she does not say, "Be careful." She says, "You won't be alone. There is a plan. There is always a plan in the final stages of a war, when the intelligence is gathered, and the positions are mapped, and the only thing left is to walk through the door. Arnim Zola's information has given the Strategic Scientific Reserve everything they need. They know where Schmidt's final base is. They know what he is building. They know that the Hydra weapons powered by the Tesseract are intended for American cities, a last, desperate strike that would change the course of everything. The plan is Steve's, and it is characteristically direct. He will ride in alone, break through their defenses, and hold the gate until the army arrives behind him. Think about that for a moment. A man riding alone toward the final stronghold of an army built on weapons from another world. Not because he has to. There are other strategies, other approaches, safer paths, but because this is how Steve Rogers fights. Forward, directly, with the absolute commitment of a man who decided a long time ago that the only direction worth moving is toward the thing everyone else is running from. The motorcycle carries him through the forest, and the trees blur, and the world narrows to the road ahead. And somewhere in the rhythm of the engine, Steve is not thinking about tactics or strategy or the military calculus of what comes next. He is thinking about Bucky, about Brooklyn, about the distance between who he was and who he has become, and whether the distance means anything, and whether the boy from Brooklyn would recognize the man on the motorcycle, and whether it matters. He reaches the base. The defenses close around him. And the fight that follows? Well, the fight is fierce and fast, and it ends the way these things end, with Steve standing among the wreckage of Hydra's outer perimeter, shield dented, breathing hard, and the army flowing in behind him through the breach he made. But the base has teeth, flamethrowers, heavy weapons, numbers, and eventually, inevitably, they bring Steve down, not with a single blow, but with the patient mathematics of overwhelming force. He is captured, surrounded, brought before the Red Skull. Schmidt's quarters are sparse and cold, the way the quarters of a man who has left humanity behind tend to be. Schmidt looks at Steve with something that is not quite contempt, and not quite curiosity, something colder, more clinical, as if he is examining a hypothesis that has failed to prove itself. He asks Steve why Erskine chose him, what made this man, this particular, unremarkable man, worthy of the gift that Schmidt himself was denied. And Steve, bruised and captured and kneeling on the floor of a madman's fortress, answers with the simplest truth he knows. There is nothing special about me. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn. Schmidt does not understand the answer. He never will. Because the answer is not about strength or worthiness or special qualities. The answer is about a boy who got knocked down in alleys and got back up every time, not because he was brave, but because he didn't know how to stay down. Schmidt looks at power and sees destiny. Steve looks at power and sees responsibility. They will never understand each other. They were never meant to. Schmidt raises his weapon, and the window behind him explodes inward as the Howling Commandos arrive, because of course they arrive. Loyal, impossible, right on time, and the chaos that follows is brief and decisive, and ends with Schmidt running and Steve running after him. Falsworth throws him the shield. The corridors of the base blur past, and Schmidt reaches his final card, the Valkyrie, a bomber, massive, loaded with drone aircraft targeted at every major American city. This is Schmidt's apocalypse, his final statement, and it is already moving, engines screaming, taxiing toward the runway, gathering speed. Steve runs, through the battle, through the gunfire, leaping over the heads of fighting soldiers. He is not fast enough. The Valkyrie is pulling away, gaining speed, and Steve is losing ground. And for a terrible moment, it seems like this is where the story ends, with a man running after a plane he cannot catch. Then Chester Phillips pulls up beside him in a car, Schmidt's own car, as it happens, with Peggy Carter in the passenger seat, and they give Steve the ride of his life. The car has a boost. Phillips uses it. They surge forward alongside the wing of the Valkyrie, and the runway is ending, and the plane is lifting off, and there is one moment, one heartbeat for what needs to happen. Steve turns to Peggy. They look at each other, and she kisses him. Not a long kiss. There's no time for a long kiss, but a real one. A first kiss. A last kiss. The kind of kiss that contains an entire future that will never happen, compressed into the space between one breath and the next. Then Steve jumps. The plane rises. The ground falls away, and Peggy Carter stands on the runway and watches him go. On the Valkyrie, Steve finds what he expected to find. The drones. The weapons. And at the end of a long fight through the belly of the aircraft, Johann Schmidt in the cockpit, with the Tesseract glowing in its cradle behind him. Their final confrontation is not a battle. Not really. It is two men Two versions of the same experiment, reaching the end of a conversation that began in Erskine's laboratory. Schmidt believes in power. Steve believes in people. And when the Tesseract is knocked from its cradle, when Schmidt picks it up with his bare hands, because he cannot help himself, because he has always reached for power he does not understand, the sky opens above him. A light, fast and cold, pours down through the breach, and Johann Schmidt is taken, transported, removed from the world as completely as if he had never existed. Steve watches him go. The light fades, the breach closes, and the Tesseract, still burning, melts through the floor of the aircraft and drops into the ocean below. Steve is alone. The cockpit is quiet now, just the hum of the engines and the whistle of wind through broken windows, and the steady, faithful sound of instruments ticking toward a destination that cannot be changed. The Valkyrie is aimed at New York. The autopilot is locked. The landing controls are damaged, twisted, fused, non-functional, and the plane is fast, too fast. The coast is approaching, and there are millions of people in its path, and Steve Rogers knows what he has to do. He sits down in the pilot's seat. The instruments glow green in the dimness. Through the windshield, below the clouds, he can see the Atlantic, gray and vast and very, very cold. He picks up the radio. There's static first, the crackle and hiss of a signal reaching across hundreds of miles of open air. Then a voice, Jim Morita's, answering from the captured Hydra base. And then another voice, closer, warmer, the one Steve needs to hear. Peggy, he tells her, simply, directly, the way Steve tells everything. Schmidt is dead. The plane is headed for New York. The landing controls are gone. There is no way to bring it down safely, and if it reaches the city, the weapons on board will kill millions of people. He has to put it in the water. There is a silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of everything that will not be said, everything that cannot be said, all the futures and possibilities and ordinary mornings that are being quietly, irrevocably set aside. Peggy tries. Of course she tries. She tells him to hold on, that they can work something out, that Howard can find him a way down. She is looking for the landing, because Peggy Carter has never accepted the word impossible, and she is not going to start now. But her voice knows. Somewhere beneath the determination, her voice already knows. The plane is descending. Through the windshield, the ocean is getting closer. The gray is becoming texture, waves, whitecaps, the endless, restless surface of the North Atlantic. Steve reaches into his pocket. He opens the compass. Peggy's photograph looks up at him from behind the glass. Black and white, steady-eyed, beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with the red dress and everything to do with who she is. The talk about dancing, it comes out naturally, the way the most important conversations always do, not as a grand declaration, but as something small and warm and ordinary. Saturday night, Steve says, at the Stork Club, 8 o'clock on the dot. He tells her not to be late. Don't you dare be late, she says, and you can hear it if you listen carefully. The way her voice holds steady, the way she refuses to let it break, because breaking would make this real, and for as long as they are still talking, it is still just a conversation between two people making plans. The ocean fills the windshield. Steve can see the individual waves now, the white lines of foam, the dark water beneath, the altimeters unwinding. I'm going to need a rain check on that dance, he says, and the line goes quiet. Not dead, Quiet, a held breath, a pause in which the entire weight of the conversation, the entire weight of the war, the entire weight of two people who found each other too late and not long enough, settles into the space between the static. Then the signal breaks, and Peggy Carter says his name into the silence, and no one answers. The plane hits the water, and then there is cold. Not pain. The impact is too massive for pain, too total, the kind of force that bypasses the nervous system entirely and registers only as a vast, white, all-encompassing fact. Cold. The deepest cold Steve has ever felt. Deeper than the winters in Brooklyn. Deeper than the Alps. Deeper than anything the serum was designed to withstand. The cold of the Arctic Ocean, rushing in through the shattered windshield, filling the cockpit, filling everything. The world goes white. The kind of white that is not a color, but an absence. The absence of detail, of distinction, of the things that separate one moment from the next. The instrument panels fade. The sound of the engines dies. The compass slips from Steve's fingers. Or perhaps his fingers slip from the compass, and Peggy's face drifts away into the white, like a photograph sinking into still water. And then quiet. The deepest quiet. Not silence. Silence is sharp. Silence has edges. This is quieter than silence. This is the sound the world makes when it stops expecting you to participate. The creak and groan of the aircraft settling into the ice. The slow, patient compression of frozen water closing around metal. The faint, almost imaginary sound of Steve's heartbeat, still going, because the serum will not let it stop, because the serum was designed to keep him alive, and it will keep that promise long after Steve has stopped asking it to. The cold becomes a blanket, the white becomes a room, and Steve Rogers, Captain America, the kid from Brooklyn, the boy who was too dumb to run away from a fight, closes his eyes, not in surrender, in something gentler than that, in the slow, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has carried everything he was asked to carry, and more, and done it well, and is very, very tired. Somewhere above the ice, the world goes on. The war ends. Flags are waved. Soldiers come home. Peggy Carter builds something extraordinary from the wreckage of her grief. Howard Stark searches the Arctic for years, finding not a body but a blue cube that hums with the light of distant stars. The Howling Commandos grow old. Brooklyn changes. Everything changes. And beneath the ice, perfectly still, perfectly preserved, a heart continues to beat, slowly, patiently. One beat, then another, then another. A rhythm so faint it is barely there at all. The quietest sound in the quietest place in the world, marking time that no one is counting. The ice holds him the way the earth holds a seed in winter. Not gone, not finished. Waiting. Waiting in the white and the cold and the silence, in the space between one story and the next, between the war and whatever comes after. 70 years of stillness, 70 years of ice, and somewhere faintly, like a memory you are not sure you actually have, the ghost of a song you might have heard once, in a pub in London, on a night when the amber light was warm and the voices were loud, and a woman in a red dress asked you to dance. Somewhere, beneath all that frozen silence, there's still a heartbeat, still going, still waiting to wake up. Continuity note. 70 years of stillness. 70 years of ice. And somewhere, faintly, like a memory you are not sure you actually have, the ghost of a song you might have heard once in a pub in London, on a night when the amber light was warm and the voices were loud, and a woman in a red dress asked you to dance. Somewhere, beneath all that frozen silence, There is still a heartbeat, still going, still waiting to wake up.